The jungle pressed in like a living wall, humid air sticking to skin and gear alike. The river at their side was silent, black, and endless, a ribbon of water that could swallow sound as easily as it swallowed light. On its banks, crouched in the shadows, a squad of Navy SEALs prepared to move out. The mission had been outlined back at base, under the harsh white glow of fluorescent lights, maps spread across the table and satellite images flickering on the screen. Intelligence suggested that a local insurgent group had established a weapons cache deep inside this stretch of river territory. It wasn't just rifles and ammunition they were stockpiling. There were rumors of shoulder-fired rockets, explosives, maybe even anti-air equipment. If that was true, the cache could change the balance of power in the region. The SEALs had been sent not just to confirm, but to eliminate the threat. The plan was straightforward on paper. Insert quietly, move along the riverbank under cover of darkness, reach the suspected site before dawn, and mark the target for extraction or destruction. But every man on the team knew that straightforward never lasted once boots touched soil. They checked their weapons again, though they'd already done it twice. The team leader, Lieutenant Cross, crouched at the front of the formation, whispering instructions into the radio. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, the kind of clipped tone men recognize when a leader carried doubt. Because something was wrong. Their sniper wasn't in position. Normally, he'd have gone in ahead, like a ghost in the jungle. He was the one who saw what others couldn't, who put an invisible blanket of security over every mission. With him watching from high ground or concealed shadow, the team could breathe easier, knowing that unseen eyes tracked every move. But tonight, there was nothing. Cross had sent him to set up earlier in the evening. By now, the sniper should have been covering them from a hidden perch, feeding quiet updates through the comms. Instead, silence. The sniper had vanished into the dark. The men felt it. Petty Officer Kane, the point man, glanced back more than once as they prepared to move. He was a seasoned operator, but tonight his grip on his rifle was tighter than usual, knuckles pale under the paint. Behind him, Ramirez muttered under his breath, low enough that only the man beside him heard, "Where's the sniper?" The words hung like smoke. They carried farther than intended, picked up by another operator, then another. Soon the whisper threaded through the team, soft, nervous, almost superstitious. Where was he? The jungle answered with nothing but the hiss of insects and the occasional rustle of branches. Cross cut the chatter with a sharp gesture. Focus, but even he couldn't shake the unease. He knew his sniper, Master Chief Dalton, wasn't careless. If Dalton was silent, there was a reason. And yet, Cross felt exposed, like a man stepping into a boxing ring without gloves. They began their slow advance, boots sinking into wet earth, careful not to break branches or snap twigs. Each movement was deliberate, practiced, but the tension was thicker than the air. The river reflected slivers of moonlight, offering brief flashes of silver between the reeds. Shadows swayed, and the men's eyes darted constantly, searching for threats in the dark. Still no sniper. The SEALs tried to bury the thought under discipline. Training drilled into them that no matter what went wrong, they had to execute. But training couldn't erase instinct, and instinct told them they were walking blind. Kane slowed at a bend in the trail, holding up a fist. The squad froze instantly, rifles snapping into position. A sound carried from the tree line a low creak, like a branch under weight. The jungle grew still. Cross signaled to hold, scanning through the NVG scope. Nothing moved. But in the silence, one of the younger operators whispered again, "Where's the sniper?" The words came out half a question, half a plea. Cross clenched his jaw. He couldn't afford that kind of doubt spreading through the squad. A SEAL team thrived on trust, on knowing that every man was where he was supposed to be. Tonight, That chain felt broken. He clicked his radio once, a short burst meant for Dalton. No response. Only static. The river gurgled softly beside them, as if mocking the silence. Cross exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think. Dalton was out there. He had to be. The man was too disciplined, too good at his craft to simply vanish. Maybe he'd found a better position. Maybe he was stalking enemy movement. The possibilities were endless, but none of them offered comfort. They pushed forward again, deeper into the darkness. The jungle canopy closed overhead, swallowing the stars, leaving only the faint glow of moonlight filtered through leaves. The air smelled of wet earth and decay. Every sense was sharpened to a blade's edge. Ramirez muttered, "Feels like eyes on us." Kane hissed back, "Keep your mouth shut." But the feeling was real. They all felt it, the creeping certainty that they were being watched. And without Dalton's overwatch, that possibility carried more weight. Cross raised a hand, signaling for a brief halt. The squad crouched low, scanning in every direction. The silence stretched on, heavy, almost unbearable. Then came another whisper, barely audible, carrying through the line like a current. "Where's the sniper?" It was the third time now. No one answered. The jungle gave nothing away, but each man's heartbeat was loud in his own ears. The mission was just beginning, and already doubt had taken root. The sniper was their unseen shield, and tonight, that shield was missing. Still, orders were orders. The cache was out there, and the clock was ticking. Cross signaled again, and the SEALs rose, melting back into formation. They would move forward. They had no choice. But as they advanced, each man carried the same thought at the back of his mind, unspoken but present with every step. If the sniper isn't here, then who is watching us? The jungle had its own heartbeat. It pulsed in the drone of insects, the rustle of leaves overhead, the distant cry of something unseen in the canopy. The SEALs moved through it like shadows, every step rehearsed, every glance calculated. Their formation was tight, disciplined, but inside each man's chest, unease gnawed. They were missing their shield. The sniper. In the field, he was more than just a rifle. He was an invisible wall between them and death, a watchful eye in the unseen angles where danger always lurked. Tonight, that wall was gone, and though the men said little, the absence echoed in every movement. Cross led them forward, scanning the river's edge through night vision goggles. The water glowed faintly green through the lenses, its surface slick and glassy, broken only by reeds jutting like spears from the bank. Beyond the river, the tree line thickened into blackness. He saw shapes in every shadow, enemies in every branch. The training told him to trust the silence, but the silence tonight felt hostile. Behind him, Kane muttered under his breath, words meant only for himself, but caught by Ramirez walking close. "This doesn't feel right." Ramirez didn't reply. His jaw was set, his rifle aimed into the dark. Sweat beaded on his temple and slipped down his neck. They pressed deeper, senses stretched taut. Then it happened. A crackle not of a twig, but of static in their radios. Brief, sharp, like the ghost of a voice trying to cut through. Every man froze, ears straining beneath their helmets. Cross tapped the coms once, the signal for silence. The sound was gone as quickly as it came. The squad waited, crouched in the mud, breathing shallow. They listened for the enemy. A shout, a shot, the shifting of boots. But nothing came. Only the ceaseless hiss of the jungle. Cross's jaw tightened. He knew the sniper's radio was tuned to their net. Was that him trying to reach them? Or was it interference, something else bleeding into the channel? He gave the signal to move again, and they resumed, slower this time. The jungle changed as they advanced. The trees closed tighter together, strangling what little moonlight bled through. The air felt heavier, wet with mist rising from the river. Their boots sank into mud that clung like glue, forcing them to yank free with each step. The further they went, the more the silence grew. Even the insects seemed to hush, as if the jungle itself were holding its breath. That was when Ramirez leaned closer to Kane and whispered, "Where's the sniper?" The words came like a superstition, the kind spoken to ward off fear. But it had the opposite effect. Kane's shoulders stiffened. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The whisper traveled, caught by another operator a few feet behind, repeated almost unconsciously. Soon the squad carried it like an echo between them. "Where's the sniper? Where's the sniper?" Cross heard it. He wanted to cut it down, to bark an order that would bury the doubt. But he didn't. He couldn't. He felt the same unease crawling through his own skin. They reached a clearing of sorts, a narrow gap where the jungle thinned and the river widened. Cross raised his hand, signaling a halt. The men crouched low, rifles scanning every angle. The river moved sluggishly, a black ribbon that reflected fragments of the sky. Across the water, the tree line loomed dense and silent. Cross's eyes swept its edge through his scope. Nothing, no figures, no movement. But the longer he stared, the more convinced he became that something was there, hidden, watching. Kane shifted uneasily, his rifle steady, but his voice a low growl. "We shouldn't be this exposed." He was right. The clearing offered them no cover. Without their sniper, it was the worst place to pause. If an enemy had them in his sights, they were nothing more than silhouettes in a kill zone. Cross signaled them across, one by one. They hugged the riverbank, moving in bursts, crouched and silent. Every splash of mud felt too loud, every breath too sharp. The mission demanded stealth, but the weight of invisible eyes made them move like prey instead of hunters. Halfway through the crossing, Ramirez stiffened. He raised his fist, signaling stop. The squad froze, rifles leveled. "What is it?" Cross hissed. Ramirez tilted his head toward the tree line. Saw something. The others followed his gaze. Nothing moved. Leaves, shadows, the endless black. But then just for a second a flicker of light. Small, faint. Like a reflection. A scope glint. Cross's stomach nodded. Sniper? Enemy? Or Dalton? The squad stayed frozen, fingers tight on triggers, breaths trapped in lungs. A full minute passed, then another. The jungle returned to stillness, offering nothing but silence. Kane finally whispered, "That wasn't our guy." Nobody answered. They moved again, faster now, a current of tension running through every man. Sweat dripped into eyes, mud dragged at boots, but they pressed forward, driven by both discipline and fear. The jungle seemed alive with possibilities. A shadow between branches could be an enemy rifle. A ripple on the river's surface could be the hint of a swimmer. Every sound carried weight. Then another whisper. Not from the team, but through the coms. A voice, barely audible, distorted by static. "Watching." It was gone before anyone could reply. Ramirez swore under his breath. Kane looked to Cross, eyes demanding an answer. Cross gave none. His chest was tight. He wanted to believe it was Dalton, that their sniper was finally checking in, assuring them that he was out there, watching. But the voice hadn't sounded like Dalton, and the distortion had carried something colder, something that made the hair rise on the back of his neck. Still, the mission demanded movement. He signaled again, and they pressed on. As they re-entered dense foliage, the whispers returned, softer this time, almost involuntary. "Where's the sniper?" The words no longer felt like a question. They felt like a warning. The jungle had grown hostile. The river slid beside them, dark and endless, reflecting no stars now. The squad moved deeper, step by step, into enemy territory. But every man knew the truth, whether he admitted it or not. Without their sniper's eyes, they weren't the hunters anymore. They were the hunted. The river stretched beside them like a strip of black glass, its surface reflecting only fragments of the jungle canopy. It flowed without sound, wide and unbroken, a silent companion to their march. To the seals, it felt less like water and more like an accomplice of the enemy, a mirror hiding what moved beneath. Each man carried the same thought, though none spoke it aloud. Something is out there. The briefing back at base had been clear this sector wasn't just a transit route. Insurgent scouts used the river as both cover and lifeline, slipping across it under the veil of darkness. Somewhere nearby, unseen and silent, enemy fighters could already be setting their sights. Cross felt it in his bones. Every fiber of his training screamed at him that they were not alone. The jungle had grown too quiet, its usual chorus smothered into stillness. No frogs croaked along the banks. No bats cut across the night sky. Even the insects seemed muted, as if the entire wilderness knew something the seals did not. "Eyes up," Cross whispered through his mic. The men responded with a series of click-short, controlled affirmations. The formation tightened instinctively, rifles sweeping the tree line, barrels tracking shadows that never stopped moving. Kane, at point, slowed. He lifted his fist in the signal to halt. The squad froze instantly, dropping into crouches, rifles steady. His night vision optics glowed a pale green against his face as he scanned the slope ahead. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then he saw it. A shimmer in the distance, too faint to be light, too sharp to be natural. Through his scope, it looked like the curve of metal. Maybe a rifle barrel. Maybe binoculars. Maybe nothing at all. But it was enough. "Possible eyes on us," Kane murmured into comms. Cross's jaw tightened. He swept the same spot, but by the time his optics locked in, the glint was gone. The tree line looked ordinary again, a mass of tangled branches and hanging vines. He wanted to dismiss it as a trick of the moonlight. But he couldn't. Not out here. Ramirez exhaled slowly. "Feels like they're already zeroed in." No one corrected him. No one dared to. The squad pressed forward, slower than before, every step deliberate, controlled. The mud sucked at their boots with each movement, clinging as if trying to drag them down. The air was heavier now, charged as though it carried the static of an approaching storm. Cross tried to push Dalton, the missing sniper, out of his mind. The man was too skilled, too disciplined. If he wasn't answering, there was a reason. Maybe he was maneuvering. Maybe he was already hunting someone they hadn't seen yet. But the longer the silence stretched, the more Cross felt the truth pressing against him. They were vulnerable. The squad's rhythm shifted. They were no longer advancing like predators. They were advancing like prey. Ahead, Kane's posture stiffened. He raised his hand again, signaling stop. His other hand went to the scope on his rifle, scanning low along the tree line. "Movement," he breathed. Every man froze. Cross lowered behind cover, peering through his own scope. At first, he saw only trees. Dense shadows. Hanging moss. Then there it was. A figure. A blur of darker shadow against the black, slipping between trunks. Too smooth, too intentional to be an animal. "Confirm one," Kane said. East tree line. Cross's pulse quickened. If there was one, there were more. Insurgents didn't travel alone, not here. The squad sank lower into cover, rifles steady, sights raised. They watched the tree line, waiting for movement. But the figure vanished, swallowed whole by the jungle. Seconds stretched. 30, 40, a full minute. Nothing. Ramirez whispered, Ghosts. Cross wanted to snap at him, to crush the unease bleeding through the ranks. But he didn't, because he had seen it too. The enemy was out there, watching, waiting. He tapped his cums. Stay tight. They've got eyes. A squad resumed its advance, every man's nerves coiled like a spring. Their formation was flawless, honed through years of training and missions. But even the most disciplined movements couldn't erase the gnawing in their guts. The jungle seemed to shift with them, shadows stretching longer, branches clawing closer. Every rustle was a bootstep. Every ripple in the river was a swimmer. Every tree was a rifle sighted down on them. Then another sound. A soft splash from the river. The squad spun toward it, rifles raised, scanning the black water. Nothing but ripples spreading across the surface. Cross's throat went dry. The river was a perfect cover. Enemy divers could slip through it unseen, emerge anywhere, anytime. He scanned hard, eyes darting between reeds and waterline, looking for the telltale silhouette of a head breaking the surface. Nothing. The ripples faded. The river smoothed back into stillness. The squad waited another minute, frozen, but the water revealed nothing. Finally, Cross gestured them onward. They couldn't afford to stall. Every minute wasted was a minute the enemy gained. They moved deeper along the river, steps slower now, shoulders tighter, rifles fixed in overlapping arcs. The whispers came back, softer this time, unspoken but almost tangible in the air. Where's the sniper? The men didn't dare voice it anymore, but the question was there, bleeding into every decision, every cautious step. Dalton should have seen the shadow before they did. Dalton should have called it out. Dalton should have taken the shot. But he hadn't, which meant one of two things. Either he was gone, or he was watching something else entirely. Cross clenched his jaw. He hated the unknown. He hated fighting an enemy he couldn't see, hated advancing blind. But worst of all, he hated the weight pressing on his men. Their trust was beginning to fray. And in combat, trust was the difference between survival and disaster. The squad moved another 100 meters before Cross finally raised his hand again. They dropped into a crouch, forming a perimeter. The jungle was silent. The river was still. But the feeling of eyes unseen, patient, merciless, never left. The enemy was out there, and they were already in the shadows. The jungle had grown so dense that moonlight barely touched the ground. Each man's night vision goggles turned the world into a murky haze of green, every branch and vine distorted into ghostly shapes. The river flowed silently beside them, its surface broken by reeds swaying like skeletal hands. The squad pushed forward, but the air around them was heavy, oppressive, and none of them could ignore the same thought pulsing in their heads. They were without their sniper. To outsiders, it might not have seemed catastrophic. They were, after all, a highly trained unit, each operator capable of precision, each man drilled to function under fire. But to the SEALs, Dalton wasn't just another operator with a rifle. He was their shield, their reassurance, their invisible shadow. Every mission they had trained for, every deployment they had endured, had been shaped by the presence of a man like him. Kane felt the absence most keenly. He remembered Bud S. years back, when instructors had hammered into them the role of Overwatch. You don't see him, but he sees everything. You don't hear him, but he hears everything. The sniper is your ghost, and the ghost is always there. It was drilled into them until it became gospel. And Dalton had embodied that gospel perfectly. Kane remembered their desert drills at 29 Palms. The air had been dry enough to crack lips, the sun a merciless hammer overhead. Their unit had been tasked with storming a mock compound, while Dalton covered them from nearly a mile away. They hadn't even known where he was. He had disappeared into the rocky ridges, before the exercise began, like smoke fading into wind. But when the enemy role players had exposed themselves from windows and rooftops, they dropped instantly. A crack, a puff of dust, and the targets were down before the squad could even raise rifles. Dalton had been so precise, so silent, that the team had advanced without hesitation. They trusted his unseen hand as much as their own trigger fingers. Now, trudging through the jungle mud, Kane felt naked without that hand. Ramirez's memory drifted to another training op-night drills in the forests of Virginia. Rain had soaked the trees, turning the ground into sludge. The squad had been tasked to move undetected through the woods, with instructors hiding ambushes along the route. They'd been nervous, alert, certain they were being hunted. But Dalton had been up in the trees, invisible in his ghillie suit. Before the ambushes could spring, the instructors were neutralized. One after another, they dropped, tagged by training rounds from Dalton's suppressed rifle. The squad had passed through clean. The instructors had later admitted they never saw him. Ramirez could still hear Dalton's voice afterward, low and calm. "If you see me, I've done something wrong, but now, tonight, in this jungle," they didn't see him. They didn't hear him. And yet the unease wasn't comfort. It was fear. Because silence, this time, wasn't reassurance. It was a void. Cross knew the stakes better than anyone. As the officer, he had studied countless case reports of missions that went bad. In nearly all of them, one theme repeated: loss of overwatch. Units ambushed, patrols flanked, casualties piling up because they had moved without the long-range eyes that saw what they couldn't. He could feel that risk, pressing in on his squad now. Every shadow in the tree line might conceal a rifle. Every ripple on the water might hide a swimmer. Dalton's absence made the invisible enemy heavier, more suffocating. The squad slowed again, more cautious than before. Kane scanned every angle through his optics, frustration etched in the tight line of his mouth. Ramirez muttered something low in Spanish, a prayer half hidden beneath his breath. Another whisper traveled the line, barely audible but sharp as a knife. "Where's the sniper?" Cross heard it again. He gritted his teeth. He hated that the words had become a mantra among his men. They weren't asking out of curiosity anymore. They were asking because without Dalton, their world had cracks in it. And in combat, cracks killed. He thought back to Dalton's philosophy, something the man had once shared in rare conversation. "My job isn't pulling the trigger. My job is keeping you alive so you never have to." Dalton believed in patience, in silence, in making his team believe in ghosts. And it worked. He had become more myth than man among them. But tonight, the myth was failing. They crossed a narrow stretch of the riverbank, boots sinking into wet ground that stank of decay. Kane's eyes kept flicking to the tree line, his rifle twitching toward shapes that never materialized. The others followed, shoulders tight, rifles raised. The formation was perfect, textbook, but the edge of unease lingered like static. Cross gave the signal to hold again, crouching low as he scanned through his NVG scope. He needed to believe Dalton was out there, hidden, watching. Maybe he was crawling through reeds along the river. Maybe he had taken position in the canopy. Maybe he was just waiting for the perfect shot. But there was nothing. No crack of a rifle. No whispered update in comms. Only silence. And silence, in a war zone, was never neutral. It meant one of two things, either safety or the moment before an ambush. The men waited, crouched in the mud, fingers poised on triggers. Their breathing grew shallow, muffled by the masks and helmets. In the distance, a branch creaked. The squad tensed as one, rifles snapping toward the sound. But the jungle stayed still. The branch sagged under its own weight, shifting in the night breeze. "False alarm," Ramirez whispered, Dalton would have told us if it was real. No one disagreed. Cross finally signaled them onward, his hand a sharp cut through the air. They couldn't linger. The mission demanded movement. But every man felt it. This wasn't like the drills back home. Back there, Dalton was their shield. Back there, his silence had been safety. Tonight, his silence was a wound, and the jungle poured its poison into it. Every step forward was a step without him. And for the first time, the squad truly wondered if they were walking blind into the crosshairs. The squad reached a narrow bend in the river, where the jungle pressed close against the bank. The canopy above sealed off what little moonlight remained, plunging the men into near total darkness. Their night vision goggles painted the world in pale hues, but even through the green tint, the shadows seemed heavier, thicker, alive with threat. Lieutenant Cross raised a hand, signaling them into a staggered crouch. The formation fanned out carefully, each man scanning his sector, rifles steady, fingers curled lightly against triggers. They had advanced far enough now that the river behind them felt less like cover and more like a trap. One path in, one path out, the current pulling silently against their backs. The mission clock ticked in Cross's head. They were behind schedule. What should have been a smooth infiltration had become a crawl, slowed by nerves, by stops and starts, by the gnawing fear of eyes tracking them from unseen perches. He clenched his jaw, knowing that the further they delayed, the closer they edged to daylight. And still, Dalton the sniper remained silent. It had started as a whisper, harmless enough. One man's nervous question passed under his breath. "Where's the sniper?" But like a spark in dry brush, it spread, picked up and repeated, until it moved down the line like a current of electricity. "Where's the sniper?" Cross heard it again now, muttered low behind him, the same phrase that had haunted their movements for the past hour. This time it was Ramirez, voice tight with unease. A moment later, Kane hissed it too, not even realizing he'd spoken aloud. It wasn't a question anymore. It was instinct. Like men clutching at prayer beads, repeating words to keep fear at bay. Cross snapped his hand into a fist, signaling silence. The team obeyed, but the words had already settled like ghosts among them. The jungle was merciless. It amplified their doubt, fed it back in every rustle and ripple. The air was so thick it clung to their lungs, and the heat pressed down in waves, turning sweat cold against their skin. Each man shifted restlessly, eyes darting, sure that danger waited just beyond their sight. And perhaps it did. Kane caught at first a flicker of movement, low across the river, where the reeds bent unnaturally. He froze, raising his fist again, rifle sight locked. Through the NVG, the shape looked like a crouched figure, watching. His heart hammered as he steadied his aim, but in the span of a blink, the figure dissolved into shadow. "Contact?" Ramirez whispered, breath tight. Kane hesitated, then lowered his scope. Could have sworn. "Where's the sniper?" Another voice hissed behind him. The words came sharper this time, frustration bleeding through fear. Cross spun halfway, glaring through the dark. He couldn't see which man had spoken, but it didn't matter. He felt the fracture forming, the silent grip of discipline slipping. The question was eating at them. Every man thought it, and the more they voiced it, the more it grew, until it wasn't about Dalton anymore, it was about survival. The squad pressed on. They hugged the riverbank tightly, their boots sinking into the muck, reeds scratching against their gear. Every sound was magnified, the creak of straps, the wet suction of mud, the faint slosh of water licking the shore. It felt too loud, too exposed. Cross forced his breathing steady, remembering Dalton's words during training years ago. The moment you think you're being watched, you probably are. He wanted to believe that Dalton was watching, unseen, covering them from a hidden angle. But his silence stretched like a wound, and the jungle pressed salt into it with every shadow, every flicker of movement. Another sound cut through the night faint, deliberate. A click, every man froze. It had come through the comms, sharp and metallic, like a radio being keyed somewhere. For an instant, Cross's chest lifted with relief. Was it Dalton finally checking in? But no voice followed. Only silence, heavier than before. Ramirez whispered harshly. That was him. It had to be him. But Kane shook his head. Or someone listening. The words hit hard. The squad shifted uneasily. If the enemy had hacked their frequency, they weren't just being watched, they were being tracked. Cross signaled them down into a crouch, forming a hasty perimeter. The men obeyed, rifles aimed into the jungle, scanning furiously. But nothing moved. The trees swayed gently with the night wind. The river rippled softly, carrying its secrets downstream. And still, beneath the silence, the whispers crept back. Where's the sniper? This time it wasn't one voice. It was two, overlapping. Almost involuntary. Cross ground his teeth. He knew the danger. Fear wasn't just emotional, it was contagious. In combat, whispers could be deadlier than bullets. Once they spread, they undermined trust, discipline, cohesion. And without cohesion, even the best-trained squad could be torn apart. He clicked his mic once, deliberately calm. Focus. We keep moving. The men rose reluctantly, following his lead. But Cross could feel it. The whisper had already done its damage. A jungle no longer held just external threats. It held the cracks forming inside his team. They moved again, deeper into the darkness. Each man walked slower than before, every step heavy with caution. The river flowed on beside them, an endless black mirror. Somewhere beyond the tree line, unseen eyes watched. And as they advanced, the whisper repeated again, carried like a ghost through the squad. Where's the sniper? This time, no one silenced it. Because now, they all needed the answer. The river had been their guide all night, a ribbon of black silk threading through the jungle. It gave them direction, it gave them cover, but it also gave them fear. The water was never still. It whispered against the banks, bubbled over hidden rocks, and carried with it the suggestion of movement below the surface. By the time the squad reached the shallow ford, exhaustion tugged at their muscles. Hours of low crouching and silent advance had worn their bodies thin, but fatigue was dangerous. Fatigue meant mistakes. Cross raised a fist, signaling halt, and the men dropped into the mud, forming a staggered defensive arc. The air was suffocating. Mosquitoes whined at their ears, their bites sharp against damp skin. Sweat pooled under chest rigs and helmets, and the river smelled of rot thick, swampy, alive. Kane crouched low, his eyes locked on the water. His instincts screamed at him. Something about the river felt wrong. The current was too sluggish, the ripples too deliberate. He leaned toward Ramirez and whispered, "You see that?" Ramirez followed his gaze. At first, it was nothing but reeds swaying. Then he saw too something shifting beneath the surface. A shadow, broad and slow, pushing against the current. His breath caught. Contact in the water? Cross heard the words through the combs and stiffened. He lifted his rifle, scanning the river through NVG, but the shape melted into darkness before he could lock on. Just water, just ripples. But the silence that followed was heavier than before. The whisper came again, almost involuntary, this time from Holt, the youngest in the squad. Where's the sniper? It hung in the air like a curse. Cross wanted to snap, to bark at them, to break the spell, but his voice stuck in his throat. Because deep down, he wondered the same. Where the hell was Dalton? They moved across the ford. One by one, the men slid into the river, boots sinking into soft silt. The water rose past their knees, then their waists, dragging against them with surprising force. Their rifles stayed above the surface, steady but tense. Every splash seemed to echo. Halfway across, Kane froze. His foot had brushed against something solid, something that wasn't rock. He jerked his leg back, nearly losing balance. "What is it?" Ramirez hissed. Kane didn't answer. His eyes scanned the water, heart pounding. The river shifted again, ripples moving against the current. He swore under his breath, gripping his rifle tight. Then came the sound. A low, deliberate splash, just downstream. Not the chaotic splash of an animal or a falling branch. This was measured, human. Someone was in the river. The squad froze as one. Rifles swung toward the noise, NVG lenses glowing faintly green in the darkness. Cross's pulse roared in his ears. Another splash. Closer this time. Holt whispered, panicked, "We're not alone." Ramirez answered with the same haunting refrain. "Where's the sniper?" The whisper had become a plea now, desperate, ragged. Cross's mind raced. If enemy divers were tracking them, they were exposed, half-submerged, movement-restricted, easy targets. He clenched his teeth, ready to order fire. Then, from the reeds ahead, the water erupted. A figure rose silently, dripping and faceless under a ghillie hood soaked dark with river weeds. In his hands was a suppressed rifle, the barrel gleaming wet in the night vision glow. The shape moved with calm precision, no wasted motion, as if he had been born from the water itself. For a heartbeat, the squad froze in shock. The figure stepped onto the riverbank, water cascading off him, and only then did Cross recognize him. Dalton, the sniper. The ghost. Kane let out a sharp exhale he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief broke through the tension like a crack of lightning. Dalton didn't look at them. He didn't need to. His eyes were locked past the tree line, scope raised, already scanning for threats they couldn't see. Cross wanted to ask where had he been? Why the silence? But the words stuck in his throat. He knew better. Dalton wasn't one for explanations. He didn't talk. He watched. And in that moment, his silence felt different. It wasn't a wound anymore. It was the shield again. Dalton lowered to a crouch at the edge of the bank, a suppressor just above the reeds. His rifle tracked something unseen, something beyond their line of sight. Then, with the faintest hiss, he squeezed the trigger. A muted crack echoed across the river. Far up the tree line, a shadow toppled, collapsing into the brush without a sound. The squad stared, stunned. They hadn't even seen the threat. But Dalton had. He keyed his mic for the first time all night, his voice a low whisper carried across the comms. "Eyes on. You're covered." It was only 3 words, but to the squad, it felt like a lifeline. Cross swallowed hard, nodding silently. Dalton was back. The ghost had returned, rising from the river like a legend reborn. But even as relief washed over them, Cross knew the jungle wasn't finished. Dalton wouldn't have fired unless the danger was real, close, and closing in. The river had stirred, and now the enemy was awake. The jungle never warned them it attacked. The first shot cracked from the tree line, just as Dalton's suppressed rifle whispered again. A figure crumpled 30 meters out, dropping his weapon into the brush. But almost instantly, the night erupted. Gunfire tore through the silence, ripping branches, shredding bark, spitting sparks where rounds clanged against river rock. Cross dove flat, barking into comms. Contact left. Multiple shooters' defensive arc, now. The SEALs moved like muscle memory. Kane slid to cover behind a fallen trunk, rifle snapping to his cheek. Ramirez dropped to a knee, sighted and fired in tight bursts, cutting back muzzle flashes flickering through the trees. Holt scrambled low, nearly slipping in the muck, before Cross yanked him into position with a sharp pull. Dalton didn't flinch. He remained half-crouched at the bank, calm in the chaos, his ghillie still dripping from the river. Through his scope, he tracked the muzzle flashes, squeezed, and another hostile shape dropped silently into the ferns. The firefight escalated. Bullets sliced through leaves overhead like wasps, their hiss and snap deafening. The canopy magnified every sound, gunfire ricocheting between trunks, until it felt like the entire jungle was alive with violence. Kane returned fire, teeth bared, but he cursed under his breath. "They're probing us too many angles." Ramirez grunted, firing controlled bursts. "Feels like a push, not a patrol." Cross's mind ran cold calculations even as he fired. This wasn't harassment. This was an ambush, staged and timed, waiting for the squad to commit to the river crossing. They were pinned between water and jungle, exactly where the enemy wanted them. Dalton's voice crackled in the combs, steady, calm, the same way he sounded during training. 3 shooters, left canopy. 70 meters. Coordinated fire. Cross trusted him instantly. Kane, Ramirez shift left. The 2 operators pivoted in unison, unleashing suppressive fire where Dalton indicated. Sure enough, 3 muzzle flashes sparked in reply. 1, 2, then 3 shapes tumbled down from their perches, struck by precise return fire. The sniper's eye had not dulled, but the enemy wasn't finished. A new rattle of gunfire opened up from the opposite bank, forcing Holt to flatten into the mud. Bullets hissed so close he swore. He felt their heat against his helmet. "Flank!" Holt shouted, panic in his voice. Cross pivoted, spraying toward the new fire. The squad's world was now 360 degrees of chaos enemies in the trees. Enemies on the bank, the river itself threatening to trap them in the kill zone. Dalton shifted position, almost invisible in his ghillie, sliding prone across the mud with his rifle steady. His shots cracked softly, each one ending a muzzle flash before it could spit again. His calm contrasted the chaos, but even he couldn't be everywhere at once. Kane roared as he fired, frustration boiling over. "They're trying to box us in, LT." "I know," Cross barked back, his rifle spitting fire into the brush. "We hold the line. We break them here." A grenade arced from the tree line, tumbling end over end, its metallic body catching faint NVG glow. Ramirez saw it first. Grenade down. The squad hit the mud, pressing into the wet earth as the explosion thundered across the riverbank. Dirt and water geysered into the air, raining down in heavy clumps. Ears rang, vision blurred, but they were alive. Cross lifted his head, disoriented NVG, shaking slightly with the impact. Then he saw Dalton already reset, already sighted, his rifle tracking with surgical precision. Another muted crack, another hostile down. It was like watching death itself work methodically, never rushed, never shaken. But the pressure was unrelenting. Gunfire still flashed from the far canopy, and Cross knew the squad couldn't last in place. Their advantage was training, aggression, coordination, but pinned at the riverbank, they were being turned into targets. "Dalton," Cross barked over comms, "can you clear us a lane?" A pause. Then the sniper's voice came low, absolute. "On my mark." The squad froze, weapons ready as Dalton scanned, tracked, and picked. One muted shot, then another, then a third. Left lane move. Cross didn't hesitate. Go, go, go. The SEALs surged into motion, breaking from their muddy cover, sprinting low through the cleared lane. Kane's rifle spat cover fire. Ramirez followed tight, his weapon sweeping with mechanical precision. Holt stumbled but pushed himself forward, gritting against fear. Dalton covered their movement like a phantom. Every muzzle flash that threatened them winked out, erased by his trigger. The squad reached the tree line, diving into cover. The canopy swallowed them, and for the first time since the ambush began, they weren't pinned. Breathing ragged, Cross pressed against the thick trunk, eyes scanning. His squad was intact, alive, barely. Gunfire still rattled behind them, but it was more sporadic now, less organized. Dalton had ripped the teeth out of the ambush before it could close fully. Kane spat into the dirt, adrenaline still roaring through him. They wanted us drowned in that river. Ramirez nodded grimly, reloading with steady hands. They almost had us. Cross looked back through the brush. Dalton was still at the riverbank, his silhouette framed against the pale water. He hadn't moved with them. He hadn't needed to. He was their anchor, holding the line as they repositioned. And in that moment, the squad finally understood why the whispers had haunted them all night. Where's the sniper? Because without him, they would have been finished. Dalton rose slowly from the bank, his ghillie dripping mud, and padded silently toward them. His face was unreadable behind the camouflage, but his presence alone steadied every man. Cross met his eyes briefly and gave the smallest nod of respect. Dalton said nothing. He didn't need to. His work spoke for him. The jungle quieted, the last echoes of the clash fading into the thick night. The canopy still dripped with the aftermath of gunfire, leaves shredded, branches broken. The river gurgled on, uncaring, carrying fragments of the ambush downstream. But every man in the squad knew the truth. The fight wasn't finished. That had only been the opening move. And the enemy had made one thing clear. They were being hunted. The jungle was quieter now, but it was not safe. The ambush had been broken, the canopy still dripping from the violence. But the squad knew better than to trust silence. Silence was a trick. Silence was the predator's breath before it lunged. Cross crouched with his back pressed to a broad trunk, chest rising and falling with measured breaths. Kane and Ramirez secured the flanks, weapons sweeping, while Holt worked quickly to check their gear. Each man was alive, scraped and battered, but alive. And then there was Dalton. The sniper moved into the tree line at last, his figure cutting free from the river and mud. He looked more like a wraith than a man, his ghillie suit matted with river weeds, his face half obscured by camouflage netting. He didn't walk like the others. He drifted, silent, as if the jungle itself carried him forward. For hours, his absence had been a wound. For hours, the squad had whispered about him, desperate for his shadow. But now he was here, and every man felt the weight of his presence. Cross keyed his mic, voice steady but low. Dalton, Citrip. The sniper knelt, set his dripping rifle across his knee, and finally spoke. His tone was calm, flat, stripped of anything but fact. Enemy squad. 2 fire teams staged across river and canopy. Likely QRF element to larger force. Ambush point pre-selected. They expected us to cross by dawn. Kane swore under his breath. So they knew we were coming. Dalton's eyes flicked to him, sharp even through the green NVG glow. They knew enough. Cross processed it, his mind racing. If the ambush was part of something bigger, they weren't done, not even close. This wasn't chance contact. This was a net, and the squad had just brushed against its edge. Ramirez spat into the dirt, adjusting his magazine. Question is, how wide's the net? Dalton didn't answer with words. Instead, he lifted his rifle, adjusting the optic with steady hands, and scanned the far tree line. His silence wasn't dismissal. It was focus. He wasn't guessing. He was hunting. The squad waited, tense, as Dalton's scope traced the canopy. Then came the soft hiss of breath, a subtle shift of his trigger finger. A crack, one distant muzzle flash winked out like a snuffed candle. Dalton didn't lower the rifle. He spoke, his voice no louder than before. "Enemy spotter. Left canopy. There are more." The squad stiffened. Kane muttered, "We're still in it." Cross nodded grimly. The enemy hadn't given up after the failed ambush. They were reorganizing, watching, waiting to strike again. And this time, dawn was creeping closer. The jungle shifted with faint sounds, the crunch of foliage, the subtle thud of boots in mud, the whisper of steel brushing against gear. They weren't ghosts anymore. The enemy was closing in. Cross made the call. "We dig in here. Hold until extraction window." The squad fanned out, creating a defensive semicircle against the river. Kane and Ramirez fortified positions behind fallen logs. Holt covered the rear with a trembling but steady aim. Cross set himself at the center, coordinating arcs of fire. Dalton lay prone at the edge, his rifle resting on a mound of roots. He blended so perfectly into the terrain that even his squad had to look twice to see him. The jungle exhaled, and then the storm broke. Gunfire ripped from 3 angles at once, a coordinated push. Bullets shredded foliage, bark exploded from trunks, and the air filled with the metallic tang of lead slicing close. Contact right flank. Kane roared, unleashing fire. Ramirez answered with controlled bursts, sweeping left. Holt's rifle barked, tracers carving through the undergrowth. But it was Dalton who shifted the tide. His rifle cracked once, and a machine gun nest fell silent. Another shot, and a flanker dropped mid-sprint. He was no longer a whisper in the reeds or a ghost in their memory. He was here, alive and merciless. Every shot cut a hole in the enemy's momentum, every kill a lifeline to his squad. The SEALs fought with renewed ferocity. Their rhythm returned. Kane's aggression pushed enemies back. Ramirez's precision held the line. Holt steadied under fire. Cross orchestrated it all, his voice sharp and clear over combs. And threading through it all, Dalton's shots whispered like death's breath. Calm, steady, unerring. Minutes dragged like hours. The jungle lit with muzzle flashes. The air burned with smoke and powder. The squad took fire, mud spraying around them, bark splintering into their faces. Holt shouted in pain as a round grazed his shoulder, but he stayed in the fight, gritting his teeth. Then Dalton's voice cut in again, low and certain. One left. Far ridge. Cross trusted him instantly. Take it. The shot cracked, echoing faintly as the final hostile fell. Then silence. Real silence. Not the tense, waiting silence of earlier. This was different. This was aftermath. The squad breathed hard, the ringing of gunfire still sharp in their ears. Kane let out a long exhale, leaning back against the log. Ramirez checked Holt's wound, shaking his head with relief. Cross scanned the tree line one last time, ensuring no more shadows moved. Dalton finally rose from his position, his rifle slung across his back. He stood among them, silent as ever, dripping with mud and river water. And in that moment, the whispers that had haunted the night no longer made sense. Where's the sniper? He was here. He had always been here, in ways they couldn't see or hear. The ghost that watched over them, silent until he was needed most. Cross looked at his men, battered but alive, and felt the truth settle in his chest. The mission wasn't over. The war wasn't over. But tonight, they had survived because the sniper had emerged, not just from the river, but from myth into flesh, from silence into fire. Dalton glanced at each of them in turn, his eyes calm, his voice steady when he finally spoke. Extraction's coming. Stay sharp. And just like that, the moment passed. He faded back into the tree line, as if the jungle reclaimed him, leaving the others in awe. The seals would talk about this night for years. They would tell the story of the river, of the ambush, of the endless whispers that carried them through fear. But above all, they would remember the answer to their question. Where's the sniper? Right where he needed to be.